I want to introduce you to a terrific investigative reporter. She's an award-winning investigative reporter named Liz Whyte, and she's a reporter for Consider the Source, the state politics team. And she's, as I've mentioned, she's won awards, and in this case, and her work involves revealing, in essence, what we all know, which is that the makers of opioids continue to flood the market and continue to lobby, even as thousands are dying at the hands of opioid addictions. Please welcome Liz Whyte. Hello, Liz.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So it's this coalition of drug makers that sold Washington and state capitals on the need for painkillers, while thousands of people were dying from addictions to those very same painkillers. Your work helped expose that. What was going on there?
Yeah, our partnership with the Associated Press and the Center for Public Integrity, we did a big series looking at the lobbying and campaign donations made by painkiller makers when the opioid crisis was starting to worsen. It was a 3-part series, and we looked at first how they attacked a 50-state plan to, they had over 1,000 lobbyists during those years. And they would go from state to state and really push back on some of the limits that lawmakers were trying to put on opioids as more and more people were dying. And they had front groups who would parrot their messages before lawmakers, that kind of thing. And then at the federal level, there was a whole echo chamber of talking points. They did a lot of lobbying to create this Institute of Medicine report that talked about pain as an epidemic, 100 million people suffering from chronic pain. And so that as a result, they could go to lawmakers and say, look, we know people are dying from opioid overdoses, but we have to balance that with the concerns of pain patients. And then thirdly, we looked at how opioid makers had also been boosting abuse deterrent medications as the solution to the opioid crisis when it really was unproven. But we're still going from state to state, getting lawmakers to pass laws that would encourage their use.
Yeah, and as you say, going state to state, and you mentioned the lobbying, it was really a remarkable effort, and that's what you've detailed, is this tremendous amount of money that was spent, way past anything the gun lobby spends, for example, as they went state to state and then just canvassed Washington with this stuff.
Yeah, during the period we looked at, they had spent $880 million on lobbying and campaign contributions, which is more than what the gun lobby spent during that time. This is a lot of money. This is a group of drug makers such as Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, that had big blockbuster opioid drugs, as well as some of their associated nonprofits that they gave a lot of money to, such as the American Pain Forum.
Is the way this works that legislators need sort of a hook to hang, letting the big pharma off the hook on, to use the word hook, to overuse the word hook, but I guess what I'm saying is, do they need an excuse to kind of go, hey, it's hands off because because of the issue involving chronic pain or whatever? In other words, is that how the lobbying works? They offer up excuses for lawmakers to look the other way?
Yeah, that sounds accurate. One of the talking points, like I said, was we need to balance these concerns. And now a couple years later, as people have really woken up to how many people are dying, I think that's less and less a concern. But there still are, and not to minimize, there are pain patients with legitimate issues, but overall, opioids have not been shown to be a good solution to long-term chronic pain. You actually end up incurring a lot more risk than you might otherwise have had for being on opioids for that long-term use.
I've read studies that suggest that ibuprofen in appropriate doses can be more effective in relieving pain than opioids. I mean, in many, many cases. So clearly, it flies in the face of a lot of facts. But as you say, it's such a big money industry.
Yeah, and that's how the opioid crisis initially took off. Was there was a lot of marketing of opioids as not only a solution for terminal cancer pain, which it was initially given for in the early 90s, but for back pain, for headaches, for I broke my ankle and I get sent home with a 30-day supply of really strong narcotics. And as a result, a lot of people got hooked and eventually ended up switching to heroin, and things worsened from there.
Well, one of the things that you point to is that the lobbies, and I guess that these lobbies change their message, as you sort of alluded to even in our conversation. There are a lot of different talking points that they produce. Was these tamper-resistant caps, and in other words, we're going to make the drugs safer under lock and key, so fewer people will have access to them if they don't have a prescription.
Yeah. So one of the problems that companies like Purdue Pharma faced was that their big blockbuster opioids were going to their patents would expire, and they wouldn't make as much money from them. And so what they did was they, in many cases, pulled them from the market and replaced them with quote unquote abuse deterrent versions. So some drug abusers at the time would crush or snort their OxyContin, or shoot up with Opana or whatever. And so these versions were supposed to be harder to crush, harder to activate in that way. But you could still abuse them by just swallowing a lot of them. They're still abusable, but they were sold as this really key solution to the opioid crisis. And painkiller makers went from state to state and urged lawmakers to pass bills that forced insurance companies to pay for them at the same rate they would a generic opioid. And you could see in different states and at the federal level, all these lobbyists coming out with the same kind of tactics of wielding a hammer and trying to crush the abuse deterrent versions. Like, it was the same talking points everywhere, but a big lobbying push to try to make these the answer and make a lot of money off of solving the opioid crisis.
Liz, you've done so much investigative work, and I'm just wondering, this won a National Press Award, and I'm just wondering, take us through the process a little bit. I'm sure it's quite painstaking. There's a lot of heavy lifting associated with this, but take us through the process of how you began this and sort of what the arc was of discovering the method that the big pharma lobby went through, and indeed how you came up with this entire report once you reached critical mass.
So I was interested in pharmaceutical lobbying because they're actually one of the biggest lobbies at the state level, even though they're primarily regulated at the federal level, which makes very little sense just on the face of it. And so I was looking at what they were lobbying on and found it was frequently opioid bills, among other things, and started digging in there and kind of trying to tally up what the lobbying strength was, and came across more and more activity at the state level, including by some of their allied groups that you would not expect, like the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And from there, we decided
is that a case? Sorry to interrupt, but is that a case, because you're right, you wouldn't expect it. Is that a case where what's the relationship there? Why are they allies? Back when the opioid crisis was first exploding, 2015, 2016, drug makers had donated money to the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And at the time, the Action Network actually even advertised on its website that they looked for areas of synergy with corporate partners. And Cancer Action Network has a very effective state lobbying network. They have lobbyists in every state. And so obviously that's appealing if you're needing to pull off a 50-state policy agenda. Sure, and you'll talk to the cancer lobby before you may talk to the big pharma lobby. There's no harm in the cancer lobby, but they're actually representing big pharma. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and can get patients to the table who are really sympathetic and who compel lawmakers. That's actually a common tactic for drug makers, is to ally themselves with patient advocacy groups. Some of them have more independence than others, but for example, the American Pain Society, which was actually shut down after some other investigative reporting that was done, it was like 90% funded by drug makers. It was really just a shill organization. And that tactic is repeated elsewhere in pharmaceutical lobbying as well.
The settlement that ultimately was reached with Purdue Pharma was for how much?
Well, there have been a number of settlements actually. The first big one was in 2007 when the Justice Department had gone after Purdue Pharma for misleading the public about the risks of OxyContin. So when it first marketed OxyContin, Purdue Pharma said this is not likely to be abused. Like, you really can't get addicted to this. It's really hard to do, which is of course not true at all. And so they settled for $600 million, which was huge at the time. And since then, more and more states and localities have sued Purdue and other companies because they've seen the effects on their towns and cities and are paying, huge amounts for emergency services and Narcan, et cetera, et cetera. And so recently, the state of Oklahoma settled with Purdue for $270 million, which that was kind of one of the first lawsuits involving the Sackler family, which owns Purdue, which was very interesting.
Yeah, and obviously it would seem anyway, there's a hint that there might be more where that came from. Liz, what great work. Congratulations again on your award-winning investigative work, and we look forward to seeing the next thing that you produce. Thanks so much,
for having
Liz
me.
Whyte.